Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Without Walls. I'm Heather Vasera, your host, and my guest tonight is Angela Adkins, and she is the author of Miracle Road. And I think you are going to be very blessed by her testimony tonight. She is very down to earth, um, a little Southern like me. She's actually from South Georgia, and that's where I'm from. So exciting to have someone that is over on my old stomping grounds. So we are going to hear about how God worked his healing power in her life. Angela was involved in a crash. A drunk driver actually ran into her family's car and it almost took her life. And so she's going to tell us a little bit about that and how God worked several miracles in her life. Maybe tonight you are listening in and you're a little discouraged. I want you to know that there is a God that cares for you, that wants an intimate relationship with you, and that wants to see you healed and whole. So again, thanks for joining us tonight. I'm going to go ahead. I'm sorry we had a little late start. Sometimes technology doesn't work with us as we would like. So we apologize for that late start, but it is going to be worth it. So let's go ahead and bring on Angela. Hi, Angela.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me and letting me share my story with you all. So I'm excited.
I'm excited to have you. I'm so thankful that one of our mutual friends actually introduced us, and Angela and I talked on the phone a few months ago, and planned this day. So we're excited about it. So how are things over there in South Georgia?
South Georgia, it was warm today. It started out a little chilly, but it got pretty warm. I didn't need my coat after all, which you probably remember what that's like down here. So
I think now my body has so much accumulated to the weather here. I could probably, things where I thought was freezing before, I probably could handle it. I mean, I actually, now I'll walk out without a coat sometimes in the 40s. And I'm just like, okay, I'll be fine.
Can handle it. Yeah. For me, the tropical weather is in my bones. So 60, yeah. I'm cold. I need a jacket.
That's definitely what I used to say.
Yeah.
But I've noticed here lately, I don't know, today was very stormy in Illinois. So it was very cloudy, overcast. And I was kind of reminded a little bit of home, like the weather, because it had the humidity. I'm like, okay, great. This is not going to be good for my hair.
I know that's
one thing I do not miss about the South. I don't know if I could live on the East Coast again, because my hair, the frizz is just like, I wake up and my hair is in like ringlet curls.
I know how that is. Thank God for flat irons.
I know, right? Thank God for those.
Mm-hmm.
So you wrote Miracle Road with a friend of yours, actually a mutual friend of ours, Jessica Erico.
You know Jessica.
And I actually worked with her at the Carenet Pregnancy Center in Camden. So that's exciting. She's awesome. She helped you write this book, and it published, was it in 2019?
Yes, it was December 2019, right before COVID hit and shut a lot of stuff down. But I was able to do some book signings and still doing book signings and speaking and sharing my story and get my book out there. So, but yeah, it was 2019, December, when it published.
So you do quite a few different things. You are part of the Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, and you've been an advocate for them for how long now?
Oh, wow. It's been a long time. I'd say by about 92, I think was when the crash happened in 89. And then it took me a few years, because I was still in school and everything. And then finally I reached out to them and wanted to be a part to hopefully make a difference for other people and hopefully stop some people from drinking and driving. So I share my story with them, and it's actually Mothers Against Drunk Driving, because we say we're not
sorry.
driver. Yeah. Oh no, that's okay. Sometimes we say that a lot when we're speaking, and say that we're against the act, not the persons at the act of drinking and driving. So I've been involved with them for a while.
Awesome. And you're also a musician. You played at several churches and a
Yeah.
keyboardist and a pianist, so that's exciting. So give
Yeah.
us some background about your family. We know this crash you just said happened quite a while ago
Hmm.
when you were young. Were you 14, 15?
Yes, I was 14. It was just 12 days before my 15th birthday when the crash happened. We were even in the car before he hit us, or before I fell asleep. We were talking about my birthday party coming up and
Mm,
a trip we were getting ready to make and stuff. So we were already planning stuff out before that happened.
gotcha.
Yeah, but we were. Do you want me to go ahead and go into my story? Is it
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Go ahead, and just whatever. Tell us.
okay?
I guess take us back. Can you take us back maybe to that day? What y'all were doing? Who your family was? Mom,
Yeah.
dad. I think it was mom, dad, and sister that were there.
Yes. Yep. My dad is a pastor. Um, he's been a pastor all my life, so I was born and raised in church.
Yeah,
Um,
you kid.
yeah, yep, that was my whole life. So, and I actually got saved at the age of 4, because being raised up in it and stuff. And I had heard all about Jesus, so by 4, I knew that I wanted to give my heart to the Lord and I wanted Jesus to be my savior. So, I was at a revival and I went up for prayer, and mom and dad and the evangelist that was there prayed for me, and I lifted my little hands, praising the Lord. And
Mhm.
afterwards, that night, mom was thinking, well, does she really understand? She's only 4. Does she understand what it means to get saved? So that night, she asked for God to give her a sign. That night, I had a dream. The next morning, I came down the stairs, wiping my eyes from where I've been crying. And dad said, Angela, what's wrong? And I said, nothing. I had a dream of Jesus on the cross. And he looked down at me and said, Angela, I love you and I died for you. He called me by name. So when I told them that, that mom was like, okay, that's it. She knows, she
Mhm.
knows what being saved is. So she had no more doubt that I had given my heart to the Lord.
Yeah.
So since
Your
4, I've
mom,
been,
she was like a real strong woman of faith as well, right?
oh yeah, oh yeah. Her and dad both were rocks for me and my sister, really brought us up in the Lord and taught us what it meant to serve the Lord, and that was their whole life. And we learned that from them as well. So but yeah, that's how I started out and then grew up. And of course I had to learn a lot throughout my years and stuff too. And didn't mean that I was perfect my whole life, but
Right. It's
I
a
still had,
journey.
yes, it is a
We
journey
continue to learn more
daily.
and more about the Lord as we grow with Him.
Yes, it's a daily journey for sure.
But I
So
believe the
that's,
Holy Spirit definitely can draw you in even as a young person. I
oh
think I
yes.
was 5 when He
Oh,
called
were you?
me. Yeah. So,
Awesome. Yep.
yeah. So,
God does it. And I believe He has a plan for your life and my life. And so I grew up in church, my dad being a pastor, and mom, she was a helpmate to him throughout his whole ministry. And he evangelized some too. We traveled a lot. And he had started a few churches and pastored a number of churches as I was growing up. So at this time, that the crash happened, we were living in Mississippi. And at the time, my dad was pastoring 2 churches. He had one that in Mississippi, if anybody knows where Hattiesburg is, it was in Petal, right next to Hattiesburg.
mhm.
And then the other church was in Bay Springs, Mississippi. And that church took us like an hour to drive back and forth from that church. So that's where we were this Wednesday. It was on a Wednesday. It was October 14th, 1987. And that day was just like any other day to me. I went to school, I hung out with my friends in between classes, and just the normal stuff. When I went home, I had dinner, in between, get my homework done, had dinner, and we got ready for church. Well, after church, when we were heading home, I remember leaning my head against the window and closing my eyes. And I joke and tell people, because my sister fell asleep too. And I said, we just had a hard day at school. We were just exhausted. So a rough day. So we both fell asleep in the back seat. And I remember leaning my head against the window and closing my eyes. And after that, I saw bright lights and I heard my mom yelling my name from a distance, almost like, have you ever had the wind knocked out of you when you were a child? or that that happened later on when God breathed life back into me. But when you're outside playing and stuff, and when you were a child outside playing, and your mom calls you in for dinner or something, that's what I heard. Sounded like mom was calling me back, calling me back, and I didn't know what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
What had happened is, Dad said he could tell it detail by detail, but it happened so fast. He said, of course, we were going down the 2-lane highway, and my dad noticed a car heading in our direction. And Dad, first didn't know what was going on, and the car went off on the shoulder of the road. So Dad thought, well, it was on a 2-lane highway. There were side roads and houses and stuff. So he thought maybe the car was turning down a side road, getting ready to turn down a side road or into a house, when the car swerved again, heading straight for us again. Dad slowed down and swerved, hoping to avoid a head-on collision, hoping to avoid the car altogether, when the car swerved again. And that time he clipped the passenger side of the car in the front and went all the way down the passenger side of the car, which I was on the passenger side in the back seat. Um, the impact was so hard that it knocked us into a field on the other side of the street. And when the car finally stopped, we landed between a propane gas tank and a tree. And we had less than a foot on either side. And from the impact being so hard, it knocked both driver's side doors open. And when the car finally stopped, my sister was trying to get me to respond, because the way the car smashed in, I was laying on her, because the whole passenger side smashed in. I was
Mm-hmm.
laying on her, and she had woke up, and she's saying, "Angela, the car stopped. Get up, get up." And at the same time, Dad was checking on Mom. She was hyperventilating, trying to catch her breath. She was on the passenger side in the front seat. She was trying to catch her breath. And Dad was trying to see if she was okay, while she said she was trying to get out, "Are the girls okay? Are the girls okay?" But she couldn't get it out because she couldn't catch her breath. Well, while he was checking on her, my sister kept trying to get me to respond, and couldn't get me to respond. No answer, no movement or anything. And she started smacking me in the face. "Angela, get up, Angela," and smacking me. And she said, still no response. So she looked at my chest, and I was not breathing. So she started screaming, and she maneuvered out of the car, and that Mom was pinned in, so she couldn't get out. She said she managed to turn enough where she could see me. Dad got into the back seat, and he started saying, "Angela, please answer me. Please answer Daddy. Please answer me." They were devastated. And he said he couldn't get a response from me at all. So he went running into the street, screaming for someone to call for an ambulance. And people were coming out of their homes, and people had gathered around Dad. And they said they had heard the impact within a 1-mile radius. That's how hard he hit us. So people were coming out, walking down to see what had happened. So they gathered around Dad. They said they called, and the ambulance was on their way. And then they asked him if he was okay, because he had blood running down his face. And he said he couldn't even feel it. All he could think about was that I was dead. Then he heard Mom yelling, and he turns around and he sees the driver. He didn't know he was drunk yet. Sees the driver leaning into the car, getting ready to try to give me mouth to mouth. Dad was so upset. He's a pastor, he's a Christian child of God, but he's also an earthly father that
Yes.
has emotions and stuff. So he was so upset. He ran over, and my dad was a boxer in high school and stuff. He's short and stout. So he ran over, and he grabbed the guy off of me, and he grabbed it. He was holding him by the collar and holding him close to him. He said, "Leave my daughter alone." And he said when he did that, he had him close, he smelt the alcohol on his breath. And he said, "You're drunk." And he let him go. And then, of course, the pastor preacher come out in him, and he started telling him he needed God, telling him what he did was wrong, and preaching to him on the side of the road. Then he got back into the car with me, and Mom, like I said, just managed to be able to turn enough where she could see me, and they started praying. And they were saying, Mom was praying, God, you gave her to us. Please don't let her die. Please don't let her die. And Dad was praying. And all of a sudden, they just felt the presence of the Holy Spirit fill the car. And Renee said, as that happened, my sister said people were outside of the car. She said, and this was in Mississippi in October. It's kind of like here, where it's warm and stuff.
Mhm.
And there was no wind or breeze. But she said when they started praying, she felt like a gust of wind go by. And she said a lady standing next to her felt it too and said, did you feel that? And then she said the car started to shake. And then all of a sudden I started breathing again.
Wow.
And and that's what I was talking about. If you've had the wind knocked out of you when you were a
Mhm.
child, that they said that's what it sounded like, that gush of air coming out of my mouth, out of my body. And we all believe, that God had breathed life or restored life back to my body right then and there. I don't remember much, just the bright lights and hearing Mom yelling my name from a distance prior to that. And I asked Mom, I said, were you yelling my name? And she said, no, I was just praying, God, please don't let her die. So I don't know why I heard that, but God definitely restored life into my body and left me here for a purpose that I believe He still has a purpose for me. So I'm trying to do His will and try to do what He calls me to do. But anyway, when the police officer arrived at the scene, found out what happened, we found out that his name was Steve. He had been to 4 bars that night. He
Mhm.
was so drunk that he had passed out behind the wheel. He didn't see us till he hit us. Our crash was his fourth or fifth offense, and he didn't have license due to previous offenses. And he was driving his dad's car and didn't have insurance. So the police officer was pretty upset. A lot of times the first responders see the devastation caused by these actions. So he was upset. He arrested him, and then he shook him, put him in the police car, and told him not to move a muscle. He went to jail. His parents bailed him out the next day. He was 35 years old, but he had not been working for 2 years because he had hurt his back on his job. So for 2 years, he was getting disability.
Mhm.
And that whole time, he was just going out to bars to take a guitar and sing and get drunk. And that's what he was doing for 2 years. And it took almost killing me to make a change. Um, when the paramedics arrived at the scene and saw the condition that I was in, so the first thing was that God breathed life back into my body.
Mhm.
And there were people around that witnessed that. Well, then when the paramedics arrived, they saw the condition that I was in. The hospital they wanted to get me to was 30 miles away. It was going to take a little bit to get me there. So they had to life flight me. They called the helicopter to life flight me to the hospital. And by the time the paramedics got my family there, they were already giving me a second unit of blood and were running tests on me. And they checked the rest of my family and released them from the hospital that night. But my mom was completely bruised down her right side from the impact of the crash. She had hurt her knees from hitting the dash; it was totally smashed in. My sister injured her leg and was on crutches for a few weeks. And Dad had glass all in his forehead from the windshield. But when the doctor came out, he told him what my injuries were. But first, he told my dad and mom, he said, I have good news and bad news. The good news was there was no life threatening situation at the moment. He said, but if they had to do emergency surgery, it would be life threatening because I had lost so much blood.
Mhm.
And then he started telling him my injuries. My right collarbone was broken, my left hip was dislocated, my pelvis was fractured in 6 places, and my back was broken in the T12L1 level, which is the mid-low part of your back. And then from the movement of the car had shifted my spine and had damaged my spinal cord. And he said that by the x-rays, it looked like someone took an axe, chopped my back in two, and then pulled it apart.
Mm.
And how that happened, the impact slung me back and forward so fast that it snapped my back. And then the movement of the car is what shifted my spine. And then that damaged my spinal cord. And one of my vertebrae was crushed. So he told my dad that I was paralyzed from the waist down. And Dad said, well, can you give me a 50-50 chance that she'll walk again? And the doctor said, no. He said, the best I can give you is a 1 out of 10. That's a 10% chance. He proceeded to tell my dad that I was hurt really bad. He said that he had seen bad injuries like that in that level before where they were paraplegic for the rest of their life. So my dad just looked the doctor straight in the eyes and he said, well, you don't know the God I serve. And he said that the doctor looked at him like he was crazy, but he grabbed a hold of faith that I was not going to be a paraplegic. I was not going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of my life. So the doctor did look at him like he was crazy. But after he left, and I'm just kind of telling this in order. So if you want to stop me at any point, if you have any questions, you can just let me know. But when he left, another doctor came in and said, um, he said, we're going to have to do surgery tonight. And Dad said, well, the other doctor just said that it would be life threatening. And he said, yes. He said, but Angela's having so much pain in her stomach. He said, all I have to do is barely even lay my hand on her stomach, and she is screaming in pain. He said, it's either her spleen or her intestines, and I have to go in and repair that, because if I don't, that's life threatening as well. So Dad was like, okay. So they were already calling people to pray. So by this point, it's like 2 a.m. in the morning, right after the crash. So they started calling more people. He signed the paperwork and everything. So they started calling more people to pray. And while they were doing that and praying, he had to call the scrub nurses in. And as they were prepping me, and I don't remember any of it, I know it's the grace of God. While they were prepping me, he said that he heard a voice before they were getting ready to put me to sleep. He heard a voice say, touch her stomach one more time. And he said he laid his hand on my stomach, no signs of pain at all. And he said all he had to do is just barely lay his hand on my stomach. And he said, oh, these nurses are going to think I'm crazy. So he pushed in on my stomach. And he said, Angela, does that hurt? And I said, and I don't remember it, but I know it was God. I said, not like it did before. And when he walked out, first when Mom saw him, she was like, oh no, what now? And because they had told him before it would be life-threatening. But when she saw him, looked again, he had a smile on his face. And he walked over and told Mom the story. And he said, I don't know what happened. And Mom said, well, I do. He said, we've got people praying around the clock. and God healed her, is what happened. And he said, well, I believe it. It turns out, he was a Christian too. And his name was Dr. Abraham, which Mom said, oh, I love your name. So he kept an eye on me for 3 days after that. They had me in ICU for several days. He kept an eye on me, and I didn't have any more problems, no issues with my stomach at all. So after that, he's like, well, she don't have any issues. I don't have to see her anymore. So that was one of the doctors I didn't have to see anymore. But I still had a long road ahead of me after
How long
that.
were you in the hospital after the accident
Um,
or the
After
crash? Sorry.
the crash, after the crash, I was in the hospital, at least I think it was 3 months total. Because I was trying to remember, because I was in Mississippi at Forest General Hospital for about 5 or 6 weeks, and then they sent me straight to Shriners Hospital, and I was there till about Christmas time. They let me go home for like 3 weeks for Christmas, and then I had to go back for another month. And that was the first time that I got to go home. So like 2 months and then another month in the hospital. So it was a little while that I was in the hospital, and I in fact had back surgery on my 15th birthday, major back surgery. But one of the things that happened was after all that with my stomach, somewhere in between there, they still had me in the emergency room. They were letting my family come back to see me, and they told my family they could not tell me that I was paralyzed. Even if I asked, they couldn't tell me because they were afraid that I'd go into shock. And I don't remember any of that, but I do remember coming to after the crash, where prior to that, all I saw was bright lights and heard Mom yell my name. When I started coming to, I was groggy, didn't know what was going on, where I was. And I said, Mom? And she said, yeah. And she happened to be in there. They had let them come back. And she said, yeah. And I said, where am I? And she told me we're at Forest General. I said, why? And she said, well, we were in a bad wreck, but everything's going to be okay. She couldn't tell me how bad it was. She said, but everything's going to be fine. And then the next part I don't remember, and I know it was the grace of God. They said I started straining.
Mm.
And then I said, why can't I move my legs? And they couldn't tell me. So mom was like, oh, well, you have pillows and blankets around your feet, which I did. And my left leg was in traction, but she didn't tell me that. But she went down and moved the pillows and blankets. And then she asked me, is that better? And my response was, yeah, with a question mark, because I couldn't feel it. I couldn't tell. And then they said I screamed, and they said you could hear it all over the emergency room. Oh God, why can't I move my legs? You know, just this terror. And of
Mhm.
course, they all started crying. So the nurse come in and told them they had to go, but she let Dad stay back there with me. So Dad grabbed my hand, and he said, Angela, you're hurt really bad. He said, but he said the Bible says, and he quoted Matthew, this is Matthew 18. He quoted where it says, where any two agree concerning any one thing, it shall be done. He said, do you believe that you will be healed? Do you believe that you will come out of this? And I said, yes. And then he prayed with me. And we grabbed a hold of faith then that I would not be a paraplegic. I would not be in a wheelchair for the rest of my life, that I would walk again, even though I'm walking with I have loft string crutches, but that's further than the doctors ever thought that I would be. But we grabbed a hold of faith right then and there. And then God continued to work miracles in my life. When I had the back surgery, it was 4.5 hours long. I was in recovery 2.5 hours. And mom said when they rolled me back from recovery, she said they hit just a little ruffle in the carpet and I groaned in pain. And she said that was so hard for her to hear me hurting so much. It was already hard witnessing it already. But
Mm.
and she thought for just a moment that she wished it was a drunk driver in the hospital bed instead of me. And then she quickly asked God to forgive her for wishing that on anyone. But then,
We don't
just
like our babies to hurt. Mamas don't like babies to hurt.
yes, exactly, exactly. And that was her thought. Is like,
Mhm.
why does Angela have to be suffering? And then she kind of resolved it in herself that she felt like God told her that I was strong, that He was going to bring me through it, and we all believed that I was going to have a testimony that I would be sharing. So we just continued holding on to faith that He was going to bring me through that. So I started getting feeling back in my legs, and mom remembers the nurse coming out and telling her at one point when I started getting feelings back, they were kept doing ink mark on my legs, and she said, well, don't, you can't, I can't remember what the nurse said is, well, don't be alarmed or don't, get too excited. But mom's like, I'm getting excited. This is faith. I believe God's healing her, just grabbed a hold of that.
Mhm.
Then, and I started getting my feeling back. Um, Little by little, it kept going down past my knees and stuff. And for a while, when they were getting me up on parallel bars, it was hard. It's like my legs felt like spaghetti noodles. But eventually I regained my strength and started being able to. I went from the wheelchair to a walker to the loft string crutches that I'm using now. And there's even some places that I'm just holding on to something that I can still walk around even without my crutches. But that's further than the doctors ever thought that I would be. In fact, many times that I'd go back for follow ups for a while before they totally release me, they would have me come back like every 3 months, and then it went to every 6 months. And they would get me in a room full of doctors and have me walk in front of them. And all they would say is it's phenomenal. And the staff even started calling me Miracle Girl because they couldn't explain, according to my records, how I was able to do what I was doing. And in fact, when we moved to Maryland, they switched me from the Chicago Shriners Hospital to the Philadelphia. Um, yeah, it was Philadelphia Shriners Hospital.
Mhm.
And while the first day there, they were doing x-rays and like checking me in again, like a new patient. So they set me in the room and mom and dad and my sister were there, and we were all sitting in chairs. Like, I wasn't sitting on the table, and I was sitting there with my legs crossed, swinging my leg. And the nurse kept walking in and walk out, walk in, walk out. And finally, we were sitting there for 2 hours, like, where's the doctor? Where's the nurse? What's going on? And the nurse walked back in, and she said, where is the patient? And I was like, I'm right here. And mom and dad, Renee, were all pointing at me. And she said, well, what's wrong with you? There's nothing wrong with you. She said, proceeded to tell me how thick my records are, and that according to my injuries and my records, I should be a paraplegic in a wheelchair. I shouldn't have been able to be sitting there with my legs crossed, moving my legs like I was. And that was just another testimony to what God had done in my life. Because I remember the night in the hospital that I was laying there at the point that I still wasn't able to move my legs. And I'll just tell you, it was a nightmare for me, because I was an active teenager before the crash happened. I loved the outdoors. I loved to ride my bike. I loved to run. So it was a nightmare not being able to move or to do for myself. So I remember one night doing therapy and everything during the day. That night, laying in the hospital bed, I was laying there and I was looking at my legs, and grabbing a hold of faith. Jesus had said in Mark 11, he said that if you have faith and don't doubt, you can speak to the mountain and tell it to move, and it will move. That you can, when you pray, believe that you receive and you will have it. So I was looking at my legs and I was saying, move, move, like telling my legs to move. And that night, I pushed them down, and then I pulled them right back up, pushed them down, pulled them back up. I was so excited. I don't know how many times I did it that night. So the next morning when mom come in, and this was the first time I had moved my legs on my own since the crash. Next morning when mom come in, I pulled the covers back and I'm like, look, mom. And I started moving my legs, and she got all excited. So it was just another.
I bet. How long was that from the time the crash to when you were able to move your
To
legs?
move my legs. It was before Christmas, so it was since the crash happened October 14th. So almost about 2 months that I was finally able to move my legs. So it was before I went home for Christmas that I finally got to where I was moving my legs. So it was exciting to me to finally do that. And then I got everything back. Even now, I've got everything back except for my feet. Feel like plastic. I can feel everything, and I can move my right foot enough that I can drive my car without hand controls, because I can press my pedals. I can play the piano, pressing the sustain pedal. And I remember being at the hospital and telling mom, at the Shriners Hospital, they had like a little mall area with a baby grand piano. And I told mom, I said, two things I need to still be able to do. I need to be, because I had got my permit. I'm like, I still need to be able to drive a car without hand controls, and I need to be able to play the piano. And I said, now that I know, what all God has done, and I think about what God has done in my life, and I'm like, he gave me the two things that I said that I needed to be able to do. I'm like, why didn't I just say I wanted it all back? But I still believe, that God's still going to do great things in my life, because I pretty much have everything back. But dad was very strong in comforting me with the scripture and everything else. And mom was like, Angela, you're going to do this. Like, even at the mall area where the piano was, she moved the stool over, had the wheelchair. Here you go. You're going to play again. Start practicing. So,
She was taking authority.
Yes. Yeah, she was. Yeah.
That's awesome.
I have great parents.
Yeah. So during this process and seeing God work, and of course your faith, I'm sure, increased because you were able to get the feeling back into your legs, and through these processes and the surgeries and things like that, how did that affect your faith?
It grew, and it's grown even more since then. But I was a teenager at the time, a young teenager when all that happened. But now and as I've grown more in the word, I understand, like, where dad said, where any two agree concerning any one thing, it shall be done. Me and him were grabbing a hold of faith then. So God honored our faith, right? And then me speaking to my legs was I was speaking to that mountain and telling it to move. And we can't do it without Jesus, right? It's through Jesus, but it helped my faith to grow. And as I'm understanding it more, even over the years, it's like I want to encourage other people, that God can do amazing things in our life when we just believe. Because, like Jesus said in Mark 9:23, he said, if you can believe, all things are possible to them that believe. And there's so many verses that I've over the years have memorized, and have my faith has really grown through studying the word and holding on to a lot of those scriptures, which are in the back of my book. I have like a healing scripture section. So I share a lot of the Bible verses that help build my faith, hopefully would build other people's faith as well. So, and I know you and I have talked about this, and it's in my book where God supernaturally restored bone in my back, and amazed the doctors with that as well.
Tell us about that.
Okay, I'd be happy to. When I was still in at the Chicago hospital, I had to wear a back brace too. That was another part. I had to wear a back brace for like 9 months, and this is like early on in my healing. I was like, when can I stop wearing this? I couldn't get up out of bed without putting the back brace on. I'm like, when can I stop wearing this? He said, well, we're going to do a myelogram just to see how your back is healing. So he did a myelogram, which is they inserted dye in my spine so they could see my spinal cord and everything. So when he came back with the results, it was just me and Mom, because Dad was in Mississippi. He had to work, so he couldn't go. Mom went and was with me the whole time, and my sister had to go to school. And so it's just me and Mom. When the doctor came in and told me the results of the myelogram, he said, you do not have bone graft on both sides of your spine. You were supposed to have bone graft on both sides, and had a crushed vertebrae that they were going to remove the crushed vertebrae and repair it with a bone graft. He said, you have bone missing. You do not have bone. You do not have bone on both sides of your spine. He said, and those long rods in your back, he said, if you don't, we're going to have to do another surgery. That's what he told me. And this was only a short time, like about 2-month period after my first back surgery. And he said, we're going to have to do another back surgery, and we're going to have to go in. We've got to take more bone from your hip, which that was painful in itself. And he said, we're going to have to take a rib out, and we're going to have to do more bone graft. And he said, we're going to have to take those long rods out. And you could feel the tip of the rods right under my skin. He said, we got to take those out and put smaller rods in. He said, if you do not have this surgery, because you have bone missing and you don't have bone graft on both sides, if you don't have this surgery, he said, your back is going to collapse. You're going to lose everything you've gained, saying I was going to be paralyzed again. And he said, those long rods are going to break through your skin. I'm 15 years old at this point, and that was
a lot to absorb.
Terror. Yeah, it was terror, So when he walked out, like most of the time prior to this, I pretty much held it together. There was one time that I cried and told Dad I didn't want to do this anymore because I was in so much pain. But he talked to me about what I was going through, but grabbing a hold of faith about Jesus, took stripes for our healing, built my faith up, and I was fine till this point. And then when he walked out, I broke. I just cried and cried and cried. Mom held me and cried with me. So then we called Dad, and Dad, he had the encouraging words. He said to me, he said, well, Angela, you know that if they have to do another, first he said, God can heal your back and them not have to do another surgery except for to take the rods out. And I was like, yeah, that's what I want. And he said, but he said, if they have to do surgery, God will be with them and help them, and you'll be fine through the surgery. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't want another surgery. That's was my thought process. I don't want to go through that again because the healing, was rough. So he said, tell the doctor to call me. So the doctor called and told him the exact same thing that he told me and Mom. And Dad said, I want to have that in writing. Can you send that to me in writing? So he did. He wrote a letter. But Dad's reasoning was he was preparing for a miracle. He was already prepping for one. So the doctor told him he's going to let me go home for 3 weeks. And then when I came back, he wanted Dad to come with me so they could schedule my surgery. So while I was at home, we attended a revival where as soon as you went into the church, you could feel the presence of the Lord. So then at the end of service, I was still in the wheelchair at the time, although I started walking at that point. I was getting stronger walking with the walker and stuff. But he rolled me up front. And when he did, the young people of the church, they were really into the Lord. They gathered around me and started praying for me. And they took me by the hand, got me up out of the wheelchair, and they were walking me around the pulpit. And while they were, one of my friends was at my side, and she was just saying, Jesus, Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Well, after all that, after we were done praying, Dad stood up and he said, while y'all were praying for her, he said, God showed me an x-ray vision of Angela's back. And he said that he felt like God said to him, I made her back. I can put that bone back in place. And he saw in the vision the bone going back in place. That the bone,
Wow.
he said, I believe that's what happened tonight. The bone is back in place. She has the bone.
Praise
So then when it came time to go to Chicago, on the way I told Dad, I'm like, I've seen so many x-rays on my back. I've seen so many models of spines, and all this stuff. I'm like, I don't have to hear what he's going to say, or what he's saying about my x-ray. So Dad told the nurse, and the nurse had prepped the doctor. So they had me in a room where they were testing my reflexes and everything. So they had me on a table, and Dad was sitting across from me. He didn't tell me at the time that this was happening. He told me after the fact. The nurse come over and said, Mr. Hicks, we're ready for you. So he walked over, and he was over there for a couple minutes, and the nurse walks in, and she's fidgeting with something. And then she goes, I'm just going to let your dad tell you the good news. And she walked out. So I'm laying on the table, good news, what good news? And I just lifted my hands and started praising the Lord. I knew what the good news was before he come in. So when Dad come back in, he told me where he was sitting in the chair, he said, I saw the main doctor, go over and look at your x-ray. And he said he looked at it puzzled. And then he went to another angle and he looked at it puzzled. Said he went every angle except for standing on his head. Then he went out and got another doctor, and then another doctor. And Dad said before he knew it, the room was full of doctors looking at my x-rays, puzzled. So then when they called him over, he said when he walked in, immediately the doctor said, well, I told you Angela was going to have another back surgery. He said, I don't have to do another back surgery. And Dad said he knew, but he wanted the doctor to say it. He said, what about that bone you said was missing? And he said, it's there now. And he pointed to the old x-ray where it was not, and the new x-ray where it was. They couldn't explain how I all of a sudden had bone again, but we knew it was God that had done it, and he had supernaturally restored bone in my back. And then, in fact, 3 years after that, I had to have the rods taken out because my back was all healed up.
Mm-hmm.
So they had Dad sign papers and say that if they had to put more rods in and stuff that they could, or if they had to do another bone graft, they could. So I remember when I was waking up from surgery, the first thing I said was, did y'all have to put more rods in? Because I knew that would mean longer recovery. And they're like, no. They said, your back was totally fine. You're healing up great. So I was like, oh, good.
Wow.
So, just another testimony to what God had done.
That is amazing.
Yes. Yeah. He's a good God. That's for sure.
When you grab hold of that faith,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, your parents were relentless on that, knowing
They
that
were.
God was going to heal you. And I think one of the important things that you mentioned was speaking the word out loud,
Yes.
claiming that,
Mm-hmm. And that's what you have to do. A lot of times when I was in the hospital and in pain, I would say, Mom, can you grab the Bible and just read to me? I could read it myself, but I just wanted to hear it out loud. So
Yeah.
she would sit there and read the Bible, just read the Bible to me. And it's like, it was soothing to me. And then grabbing a hold of faith and speaking the word of God, praying the word of God, praying it back to him, like, God, you said that if I believe, all things are possible to them that believe, and just standing on his word. That's what we had to do. And I still have to do that,
Yes.
today. There's so many different things in life that you still have to stand on the word for whatever needs you have in your life. So,
Yeah. He
No.
promises never to leave us or forsake us, but when we accept him, doesn't mean that everything's perfect. And we will have tragedies sometimes that happen.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have things that we cannot explain,
Hmm.
but he is there with us.
He is.
And
That is
he's
true.
always speaking, and
Hmm.
he definitely speaks through his word,
Hmm.
but
He
he
does. And I
also
think
speaks in
about,
other creative ways.
yes. And the poem Footprints in the Sand,
Mhm. Mhm.
and how it was at that time, the hardest time in his life, that he saw the one set of footprints. I look back at that and think that was my life during that time, that because I can look back at it now, and a lot of that seems like a dream or a nightmare. Like God was with me through the whole thing, so I was not going through it alone. Of course, I had
Right.
my family to help encourage me and stand with me in faith, but at the same time, Jesus was carrying me through that
That's
too.
right.
And I can look back at that and see that. Like, I couldn't have gone through that on my own. Or if my parents were not Christians, how much harder would that have been to go
Yes.
through that? But the faith that we had in the Lord, and then to see what the Lord did in my life, it's even now still have to trust God and hold on to him even in the hard times. That
Yes.
just trust him and trust his word. I know there had been some times that I was like, God, I had questions and stuff. And God said, but if you don't trust my word, then what do you have? Like, you have to trust me and trust what I say. So
Yeah.
what I do.
One of the ways that God doesn't leave us alone, of course, is he gives us angels that minister to us. And there's a
Yes.
chapter in your book, I think it's called The Angel's Embrace or something. I may have
Yes.
it off a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about what that chapter is about?
Yes, definitely. That the night of the crash, my sister, we're only 11 months apart, so we have a month that we're the same age. And that month, it was before my 15th birthday, so we were both 14. But so, we're not only sisters, but we're very close. We were like best friends. Um, I say were because she's with the Lord now, but growing up, we were always best friends. So when the crash happened, she was just so devastated. Even watching all of this happen
Mm.
was a nightmare for her. So at the hospital, as each one was getting checked out, everybody was in separate rooms. So she was all alone. She said she could hear me screaming down the hall, which I don't remember, but she could hear me screaming. She knew I was in a lot of pain. She was scared. So this one nurse come in, and her leg was hurting from the crash and stuff. And she said that this nurse would come in, and the nurse would, what you need, and she'd start rubbing her leg. And Renee said that the pain would go away. And then the nurse would look at her and say, your sister's going to be fine. Just watch and see. Your sister will be fine. Angela's going to be fine. So then she'd walk out. Renee would feel calm while she was in there. But
Mm.
then the moment that Renee would start getting anxious again, the nurse would come back and do the same thing and would encourage her. She said every time she'd come in, would tell her that I am going to be fine. Angela's going to be fine. Watch and see. So later, she was so comforting to Renee that a few days later, when they finally moved me to a room, I was in emergency room, then ICU for a few days, and then they moved me to a room. Like within that week or so, Renee wanted to go back and thank that nurse, because she did ask the nurse. She didn't see a name tag. So
Mhm.
she asked the nurse, what's your name? Like she wanted to remember her. And the nurse said, well, honey, you can just call me Nurse Evans. So Renee wanted to go back and thank her for comforting her that night and for being there for her. And she said that anytime the doctor would come in, Nurse Evans wouldn't be there. She would only be there with Renee by herself. So she said when she went back, she was asking for Nurse Evans, and they said, we don't have a Nurse Evans that works here. And Renee described what she looked like, and they're like, we don't have a nurse that works here that looks like that either. So finally, it all started clicking that that was an angel that the Lord had sent to comfort Renee and to also let her know that I would be fine, because she was so anxious about me.
Mhm.
And she said that she just kept saying, watch and see, watch and see. So um,
Wow, that's
then Renee realized, when she realized, that helped build her faith too, that God was going to do some amazing things for me. And he did, for sure.
Amen. That's an
Yeah.
amazing story.
Yes. And I know we're probably getting close to being out of time, but I did forgive the drunk driver. I do have that in my book. If
Yeah.
anybody
Talk
needs to check
about
out.
talk about that. Don't worry about the time. Just go ahead and tell us, this is a huge part of your story,
Yes.
being able to forgive. So tell us how that came about, because it was very hard at first. So
Yeah.
start even, at the beginning when you were still in the
Okay.
hospital.
Well, and one of the things that I'll talk about a little bit more about forgiveness being a process, but when I was still in the hospital at the time that I was still paralyzed, his parents came to see me first. Now, they said he had a son my age. I didn't know his son. We didn't go to the same school because we were in a different town. But they said because it hit so close to home for his son, that his son raked him across the coals over drinking and driving and almost killing me. And then his parents, they said his dad almost had a heart attack the night of the crash because it was so devastating for them too. So
Mm.
it's like a ripple effect. It's not just affecting one person, it affects the community of people. Um, but his parents came in with a dozen roses and they told me that they were so sorry for what Steve had done. And then they told me that he was sorry and that he wanted to come and apologize to me in person.
Mhm.
Well, Dad told him that he didn't have to fear retaliation, that if he come up there, Dad wasn't going to do anything to him.
Mhm.
So they stayed there for a little bit and talked. And when they left, I told my dad, I was like, I can't see him. And Dad said, I understand. But then he started talking to me about the importance of forgiveness. I mean, Jesus taught about forgiving in different places. And then he himself forgave when he was on the cross, being crucified. He forgave those that crucified him. So Dad talked to me about that. And he was like, if Jesus can forgive those that crucified him, how much can we forgive those that have hurt us?
Amen.
So he shared, talked me through the word and everything else. And I said, I know. And I agree. I will forgive him. I just can't see him right now. Because, I was still healing. I was still paralyzed at the time. And Dad said he totally understood that. He said, just don't hold bitterness, but you don't have to see him. And I was like, okay, I'll forgive him. So Dad went out and told the nurses that there was a possibility he was going to come up. The nurses took care of me like their baby. They put a sign up on the door. All visitors had to check with the nurses station. So that way, if he come up, they were turning him away. But I had so many people coming up to see me, between all my friends, between school and church and family and church family. It's like people were coming up every day to visit. Well, one day, Mom was with me the whole time too. So one day, Dad got Mom out of the hospital so she could have a little break. And while they were gone, my sister and a friend were there visiting with me, sitting with me while Mom and Dad were gone. And I told the nurse, I'm like, I got tired of everybody having to check with the nurses station before they could come in and see me.
Mhm.
So I told the nurse, I was like, just go ahead and take the sign down. And she said, are you sure? And I was like, yeah, go ahead and take it down. And she took it down. And I tell everybody, I'm like, I am so certain he was watching for that sign to come down. Because to me, it felt like minutes. I mean, it wasn't long after she took the sign down. Guess who came walking in? And I didn't notice, I didn't remember him from the crash because I was out of it. But I knew it was him because first this preacher walked in that had come in and told me the story of after his parents bailed him out of jail. He came up to see this preacher and had told him what he'd done. And he knew that he needed God. He needed to get saved. He prayed that night and got saved. So I say that's a great miracle in my testimony too, that the drunk driver got saved.
Amen.
Um, but so the preacher walked in first, and then his
This
parents
was
walked.
his preacher.
Yes, yeah. So he walked in first, and then his parents walked in, and then he walked in. And when he walked in, my eyes went straight to the wall in front of me. I couldn't look at him. I saw him out of, corner of my eye when I was like trying not to look. I could see him walk at the foot of my bed and come stand on the left side of me.
Mhm.
So I felt I got really warm. My sister said I turned red. She said where she was sitting, I was red. Because for a moment, that feeling of violation, this is the person that had changed my life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like I didn't really want to see him. But he said to me, he said, Angela, I am so sorry for what I did to you. I just want to know if you'll forgive me. And the only thing I could say when I opened my mouth to speak was yes. Yes, I'll forgive you. I still couldn't look at him yet, but I intended and purposed in my heart that I'll forgive him.
Yeah.
So the preacher prayed, and then they left. And as they were leaving, my parents were coming in, and Dad told me about their interaction when they ran into each other in the hallway. He
Mm-hmm.
said Steve had tears in his eyes. And he told my dad, he said, I would never have purposely done that to Angela. So that's why I'm involved with MAD. I look at it as it is a crime. I mean, they do have to face the justice system for that. It's a crime. I said, but at the same time, I know he didn't sit out and say, I'm going to hit Angela tonight. I'm going to change her life tonight. So I know he didn't do it on purpose, but I got involved with MAD to say, but these are the dangers. So don't do it. There's
Mm-hmm.
other options. Don't get behind the wheel of the car drunk. But so it affected his life and changed his life. When I speak to first time offenders for MAD, I say he had a number of chances. This is your first time to get it right after this, but he had a number of chances, and it took almost killing me for him to change his ways. So, but you have a chance now, so I do share that, now change, don't drink and drive.
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, he came back 2, 3 more times. I don't remember how much. He talked to mom and dad when he came up. And mom told him one time about wishing, she asked him to forgive her for wishing that he had been in the hospital bed instead of me. And I think that shocked him that she asked him to forgive her when we were forgiving him.
Mm-hmm.
And then he came back again and asked my dad. Now, he did appear before the judge while I was still in the hospital. At this time, MAD was still pretty new, so I didn't have the option to give a victim impact statement. But he appeared before the judge. He opted for 45 days in rehab, and that was all that he got. But
Mm-hmm.
he did turn his life around, so I do have to say that's a thing that God did do in his life. But he went back to work, and he came back and talked to Dad. He said, what can I do to make up for what I've done? And Dad said, you're responsible for the crash. You pay every single hospital bill, all of it. Our insurance had covered some of it, but there was still going to be quite a bit left. And he said, okay. So Dad had papers written up, notarized. He signed them. Every single bill went to him after that. So he did take over the responsibility of the hospital bills. So he was taking responsibility for his actions.
Yeah.
But I am involved with MAD. Now, I will say, like I said, it is a process. A lot of people think that forgiveness means, okay, I'm ready to be your best friend, when that isn't necessarily the case. Is you let go of the offense and you don't try to handle it yourself. I mean, there's a justice system when it's a crime, and you do have to handle those things. But other than that, you're not trying to make them pay for it yourself, if that makes sense. It's like when you do that, you put yourself in bondage.
That's
I
right.
believe that I healed and recovered a lot quicker because I did forgive. I did not hold bitterness. And I already had a thought, like even after I forgave him, I'm like, I feel like God's going to do something. I'm going to have a story to tell one day. And I believe God kept working in my life so that I can share what he does. And there is healing and forgiveness. And it can be a process. You might not feel great. Like when he was standing by me, I wasn't like, yay, like looking at him. But at the same time, I intended in my heart, I will forgive him. So it was a process as I was healing, and I focused on my healing, and God did it. And a number of years later, I did call him because mom had his phone number, and I did call him just as my way to say, yes, I fully forgive you, and talk to him for a minute. And he sounded like he was happy to hear from me, and I could have told him, he could share his story too. But I told him I was involved with MAD, and hopefully my goal was to help somebody else, to make a difference for other people. And he thought that was really great that I was doing that. So, and I hadn't talked to him since, but that was healing for me to do that as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. There's
Yeah.
actually one, I think one other part of their story that was actually kind of cool. Um, you got to, was it ride in the exact helicopter that,
Oh, yeah. Yes, it was the
can
exact
you
same
tell us
helicopter.
about that real quick?
Yes. Actually, a preacher that we know, when he moved to pastor the church that my dad used to pastor in Mississippi, we were in Maryland at the time, but he heard me share my story. I spoke at our General Assembly, and he heard me share my story. And he came up to me. He said, "You know, I fly that helicopter now," because he was a pastor, but he's also I knew his helicopter pilot. I just didn't know that he was flying the same helicopter that they had taken me in. So he was
Mhm,
like, "You know what?" He said, "Come down to my church." He scheduled the date for me to come down to his church to share my story at the church. And he said, "And I'm going to take you for a ride on the helicopter." And I was like, "Really?" So he talked to his bosses and arranged it that I could ride in the helicopter. So when I got there, he had me meet him at the hospital, and he took me up in the helicopter and flew me around and took me down low so I could see how fast we were going, and just flew me over different areas in town and then brought me back. But then I thought he showed me, okay, this is where you would have been laying. This is where they were working on you that night. And
mhm.
I remember looking over at the cot and thinking about it. Like, there was something, it was like a dream to me, but it was actually them working on me. I remember somebody asking my name, how old I was, where I was going, where I was coming from, where I was going. And I answered them, but I didn't know who it was. I didn't know what was going on. And he said that
Mhm.
was in the helicopter when they did that. And he said they were working on me and all this stuff. And he wasn't a pilot at that time, but they still had the log. He pulled out the log for me to look at, where they had me logged in and everything and what they had wrote down. And I was like, oh my goodness. So it was like um it was a joy ride, but at the same time I looked over at the cot and thought how what condition I was in that night. And I thought, and now here I am.
Yeah.
What a big difference between that night and where I am now, and what God has done in my life. And then have the chance to look down at God's creation and think about that I mattered that much to God, that He brought me this far, that I didn't die in the crash, that
Amen.
He left me here and He healed me and He did some miraculous things so that He could work in my life still today. So
Amen.
it was a cool experience for sure.
Yes. In your case, it was looking back at a time where you could have died.
Yeah.
You could have been permanently paralyzed, and God supernaturally healed you and increased your faith. But
Yes.
there's other things in our lives sometimes where we look back, and when we look back, it's kind of like we can celebrate like you did in that helicopter. We can look back at the
Yeah.
those moments of hard times or tragedy or whatever it is that you've gone through and
Yeah.
saying, that's when the enemy thought he had me.
Yeah.
He didn't. And
Exactly.
we can rejoice in the little victories. We may not have our full healing. We may not
Mhm.
have the full promise yet, but we
Mhm.
can rejoice in what he has done and
Yeah.
stand on that faith.
Yeah, and you can look at how far, even if you don't have the full healing or complete whatever you're praying for, but you can look back and see how far you've come and rejoice in that, how far you are versus where you could be, and can rejoice in that as well.
That's good. Um, so we have on our chat, let me see if I can get it to come up,
Okay.
Angela's website. Angela, do you have the copy of your book? I do not have your copy with
Oh,
me.
yes, I do. Here's my
So
book.
that's the book,
Yes.
Miracle Road. If you go to this website, angelaadkins.org, there's a little button and it says buy from Amazon. And that's where you can click on that and buy the book and hear
Yeah.
all the details. Because we would have been here for a lot longer if we would have shared
Yes.
all the
Yeah,
details. There's
there's
a lot that we didn't get to share. We just picked some highlights to share with you tonight. But it's very simple to read. It's well written. It has encouragement throughout it. It has scriptures, and you are going to leave feeling uh, encouraged. And I left feeling full of hope. So yes,
awesome. That's what I hope and pray for, that people have hope and their faith is built through it.
Yes. Yes. And Juan's on here tonight. He's
Oh, is he?
yes.
Hey, Juan. Awesome.
He says, talk about the popcorn. I'm not sure what that's about.
I don't know if he wants to. He probably don't want me to talk about that. That's funny. Yeah, him and my husband share that story. So
He
he's
also
fun.
he did one of the reviews in your book. So
Yes, he did.
that's
Oh, it
cool.
was a great review too. I really appreciated that.
Yeah, it
So
was an accurate picture of it. He did a good job
thank
on that.
you.
Yeah, some of our listeners know me from Loft Church, and our previous pastor actually, or the founding pastor, his last name is Adkins.
Oh,
And it's
that's
spelled just
funny.
like yours. And so I had, one person, is that like Josh's relative? And I said, no, there's no relation at all. So for
Yeah,
those
not
that are
that.
watching or wondering, is she related to Josh? No, as far
Yeah,
as we know, she's not related to Josh.
right, right. That would be cool though,
Sister in Christ. Other than that, no relation.
huh?
So that's kind of neat. But yeah, guys, go to her website. There's some other things too that you can connect with her. Maybe you are a pastor or maybe a women's group leader or something like that. You would like her to come and speak. She also does speaking, so make sure to connect with her. You won't regret it. So, Angela, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I
Thank you.
appreciate
I
it,
really appreciate it.
and I love your story. I love your spirit and your steadfast faith. It
Thank
shows.
you.
It just beams off of you.
Thank you. I'd love to share it for sure. So I appreciate the opportunity to do that.
Amen. Well, everyone, have a great night. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time on Without Walls.